afternoon or good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Welcome to the very first lecture in the very first year of the guest lecture series from Signum University's Mythgard Academy. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Michael Drout with us as our first guest today. So let me just make a few announcements, and then I will introduce Professor Drout, and then he will speak to us about Lexomic analysis of Beowulf and Tolkien scholarship on Beowulf together. So as I said, this is our first lecture in the series. Please keep an eye on the Mythgard Academy page for the other lectures as they are scheduled and announced. I can tell you who most of the rest of the guests will be in this year's series. We have Professor Tom Shippey, we have Amy Sturgis, we have Matthew Dickerson, who will be speaking about Tolkien's environmental vision, and we have Malcolm Geit, who will be talking about theology and imagination. So some very important names, some excellent guests in our series this year. Now, I've been asked to remind everyone that if you would like to chat with each other during this series, you're using the Book of Lost Tales Mythgard Academy chat room, so you can go over there if you want to talk to each other. If you have questions for Professor Drout as we go through, then you can use the questions box here within the GoToMeeting software. So feel free to type up your questions there as we go through today. So let me introduce our very first guest in this series. I'm very happy to have Michael D.C. Drout. He is a professor of English and director of the Center for the Study of the Medieval at Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts. And he teaches Old and Middle English, science fiction, and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Drout is the author of How Tradition Works, Tradition and Influence in Anglo-Saxon Literature, and Drout's Quick and Easy Old English. So some of you in the Beowulf class might want to pick that up and brush up your Old English. He has also edited J.R.R. Tolkien's Beowulf and the Critic and the J.R.R. Tolkien Encyclopedia. One of the founders and a current co-editor of the journal Tolkien Studies, he has published widely on Tolkien, fantasy and science fiction, and medieval studies. With support from 3 grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the most recent of which was just awarded today, congratulations, Mike, Drout has co-developed Lexomic methods of computer-assisted statistical analysis that have led to discoveries about Anglo-Saxon, Old Norse, Latin, and modern English texts. He's also a consultant for the Lord of the Rings Online, MMORPG, and he has appeared in the History Channel's Clash of the Gods and National Geographic's Beyond the Movie, The Return of the King. He's going to be featured in the upcoming History Channel series Monsters, Myths, and Legends, so keep an eye open for that. He's recorded many courses, including one called Away with Words Part 4, Understanding Poetry, that was a finalist for the 2010 Audie Award for Best Original Work. Among other courses and other adventures, in 2015 he will be leading tours to England and to Iceland for scholarly sojourns. Drout is currently completing The Tower and the Ruin, a book about Tolkien's work. He lives in Dedham, Massachusetts with his wife Raquel Doyen, their daughter Reese, son Mitchell, and corgi called Lancelot. So we're very happy to have Dr. Drout here today to talk to us about Lexomics in Beowulf. So, Professor Drout, take it away.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Mythgard for having me to speak here, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your Monday night and coming to listen. I really appreciate it. A friend of mine forwarded me a post about this lecture, so the lecture's been widely publicized on Twitter and Facebook and so forth. And in this, and it was, I think it was on a blog post, it said, "Don't let the horrible title scare you away from the lecture." And this shows how that I've been working on this Lexomic stuff way too long and way too intensely, since it didn't even cross my mind that it was a horrible title. So I apologize for that, and I'm so pleased that a lot of people came anyway. But a similar thing happened, and it just sort of shows maybe how my brain works, when I was trying to communicate my enthusiasm for a project that my colleague Scott Kleiman and I have been trying off and on to work on, which was to create a handbook of philological methods. And I was going on, but this is great, you know, we've got it. And one of the people said, well, maybe it sounds better in the original German. And ouch. So my apologies for the title again, but I'm grateful you looked past it. And Welcome to this lecture on Lexomic analysis. And as Serena said in the introduction, we found out on Thursday, we weren't allowed to announce it until today, that we just got our latest grant proposal approved from the National Endowment for Humanities. So that's a 2-year, $60,000 startup grant that most of that money goes to pay students so that they can work on the project during the summer. And I should say that everything that I'm going to talk about here has been done co-written, co-worked out. Oops, I don't know why that did that there. Co-written with my students, and it's showing that these methods are kind of very useful for getting undergraduates involved and able to make some contributions in even technical fields. So I have 3 goals for this lecture. The first is to introduce you to some of these new computer-assisted methods of textual analysis that we've been developing in the Lexomics research group at Wheaton College over the past 6-8 years. Number 2 is to discuss what the information that we've acquired by these methods might tell us about Beowulf. And number 3 is to show how some of these conclusions were arrived at and anticipated by J.R.R. Tolkien 3/4 of a century before we invented the methods and before the computers that could work on them even existed. That's showing you the confluence in my horrible title. And the challenge is that it takes a lot longer to explain points 1 and 2, but possibly a lot of the people here are more interested in point 3. But what I hope is that you'll bear with me through the whole explanation, because at least for me, the fun comes when all the pieces fall into place, and that takes a little bit of development. So, but maybe just to maintain the thread of interest, I'm going to start with a brief explanation of what it was that Tolkien thought about Beowulf. And now that I just said that out loud, I realize that's way too large a topic. Let me amend. I'm going to say what Tolkien thought about the history of Beowulf the poem as we have it in its manuscript form. And then once you've got that in your minds, I'm going to go through the methods, and then hopefully you'll start to be seeing on your own how close some of Tolkien's interpretations come to those new approaches. So we start, as we always start, with Tolkien's great 1936 essay, Beowulf the Monsters and the Critics. And there's also Finn in Hengist, which Alan Bliss edited and published in 1983. And Tom Shippey is exactly right in the way he noted that these texts have had absolutely opposite fates, in that everybody in Anglo-Saxon studies and beyond has read The Monsters and the Critics, and nobody reads Finn in Hengist. But they both show a little, obviously a lot about what he thought about the poem. And then there's Tolkien's Beowulf translation and commentaries, which were published last May in 2014, though, of course, the material in them was written in the late 20s through the late 30s, and some of it maybe tweaked going into the 40s and continuing. Now, I've talked about The Monsters and the Critics so many times that I should maybe resist the urge to elaborate, beyond emphasizing that the argument that Tolkien made completely changed the face of Beowulf criticism. Tolkien he attacked the idea that Beowulf had no structure, that the monsters at the center of the poem, or the monsters should be at the center of the poem rather than on the outskirts, and that the poem should be more of kind of like a Game of Thrones type political and social poem, which was sort of what W.P. Kerr and other previous critics had thought. And he rejected the idea, and fairly successfully, that Beowulf was obviously and intrinsically inferior to classical epics such as Homer and Virgil. Tolkien also attacked and seems to have pretty much routed the dissectors, by which he meant the mostly German scholars who had argued that Beowulf was made up of separate lays, short songs, Lieder, that had been cobbled together. Now, I'll have more to say about that in a minute, but he argued utterly convincingly, so setting aside the attacking the dissectors, that the poem was a unified, functioning artistic production. It was one poem that exhibited the effect of a single controlling mind. It had a single aesthetic sensibility. It had a thematic purpose in which it successfully carried that out. And here, in attacking the dissectors and also the critics who said that Beowulf had no shape or form, Tolkien's really following a lot of R.W. Chambers, who he famously quipped that to think that an epic was made up of a bunch of lays put together was the same thing as thinking that a Rolls Royce can be made out of a collection of bicycles. And that's excellent rhetoric, but not really actually very good reasoning, because they're not mechanical engineering feats of the same sort of thing, but and that's a recurring problem in the field. But it was effective critique. So, since 1936, really, whenever a scholar raises the possibility that Beowulf was made up of separate pieces, the most famous of these is Kevin Kiernan's argument based on the manuscript that Beowulf is a multi-part poem that's been put together, scholars pretty much immediately invoke Tolkien's paper that demonstrated, I should put air quotes around demonstrated, that Beowulf was a unified whole, with the possible exception of a few lines here and there, like 180 to 188 and so forth. It's therefore a massive irony, and I mean massive like the size of the meteorite that wiped out the dinosaurs sized irony, that in the commentaries published in 2014, along with the Beowulf translation, we find that Tolkien himself thought that Beowulf was a composite text in its history. That is, it was made by a poet out of a collection of materials, some of them being written texts. And that the composite nature of Beowulf goes well beyond his thinking that someone inserted the "woe will be to him who through fiendish malice shall thrust down his soul into the fire's embrace," that passage towards the beginning of the poem, but in fact that there was quite a bit more to it. Specifically, Tolkien thought that, as he put it, all this early part of Beowulf, which I wish I knew how long the early part went. It's at least lines 1 to 180, it may be 1 to 183, it may be 1 to 407, you just don't know. But he says, in all this early part of Beowulf, our poet is sticking very close to old material, already in verse, hardly doing more in parts than work over it. This is a very big deal. The idea, for example, that the introduction, the first 50 lines or so of the poem, was appended to the main text, had gotten started all the way back with Ludwig Ethmüller in 1840, and it continued pretty much until J.R.R. Tolkien in 1936. I mean, the major edition of Beowulf, Folk, Bjork, and Niles, 2008, Kleber 4, as we call it in Beowulf studies, as I'm sure you're seeing, says, in consequence of the studies of Tolkien, 1936, and Bonjour, 1950, the passage has generally been accepted as a deliberate part of the poem's design. Heh. No, I don't think Tolkien would disagree that it was a deliberate part of the poem's design, but he thought that it had some kind of an antecedent in a written text. Now, I don't want to go into incredible detail at this point because we have other fish to fry, but let me just say that the problem here is that is the same as a major problem with a lot of Beowulf scholarship over the history of the scholarship of the poem. And this is the confusion or the commixture of two what should be distinct ideas into one, and then kind of jumping back and forth between the original two conceptions. I think it's a version of the fallacy of equivocation. So in this particular case, Tolkien is saying that the poem has a unified artistic effect, or thematic effect, or effect of someone reading it. And he makes that case very, very strongly. I don't think anyone doubts, after Tolkien, I certainly don't, that the poem hangs together and communicates one big idea, and it has a unity of tone and of affect and everything else. But that does not mean that Tolkien demonstrated that all the materials in the poem were composed on the spot by a single poet, maybe working in a garret, locked away, and as opposed to being compiled from other stuff. It just means that one mind controlled the kind of putting all of Beowulf together, what an older scholar would call the architectonics of the poem. That person could still go get his material from somewhere else, rework it to suit his purposes, insert things into the poem. So what happened was that Tolkien's really strong argument for one prong of the unity argument, of the idea that it's a unified artistic poem, was assumed to show that it had a unified single textual history. And this, I think, is a mistake. And as I said, Tolkien himself thought the Beowulf poet had a source for the beginning of the poem, at least a written source in verse, therefore in Old English. So also, if he thinks Beowulf is written around 735 to 750, older source, you're starting to really push it to when that source could have been written, because you're running out of time that the Anglo-Saxons were literate and writing down their stories. You know, you start to get down past 600, and that's too early, both linguistically and for other reasons. So very interesting. I wish he had made the case. By the way, Tolkien also thought the poet had other sources, and when I say this, I don't necessarily mean written sources, but sources of sort of a different sort. Some of those might have been well-developed stories, what we think of as oral traditional tales. Some of them might have been written down, and others he thought were like folk tales, a deep folk tale motif, which he elaborates in Selig Spell, which is in the Tolkien translation as well. So, the Beowulf poet assembled and compiled. He reworked and he wrote things from scratch. And he held this folktale in his mind as part of his structure into a single long epic that is pretty similar to the copy of Beowulf we have in the manuscript, though that Tolkien thought, and I think many scholars still do, that's hundreds of years later, at least a couple hundred years later than when this compilation process happened. So you've got a composite Beowulf that is unified in artistic purpose. It's not an inept imitation of Homer. It's not a mess. It's a powerful literary work, a beautiful poem that works at every level, from individual word choice and lines up through the character of Beowulf and to the grand themes of the poem. Now, if this interpretation that I've just given you didn't come from Tolkien, it would be absolutely heresy. It wouldn't just be radical, it would be heresy. The mainstream of contemporary Beowulf scholarship would, I think, dismiss it as conjecture, and they'd say, again, the irony, that Tolkien had disproved the composite theory, and even more, someone would actually, and I saw this on the Anglo-Saxonist listserv a number of years ago, someone started to talk about composite nature, and Norman Hinton, a very nice guy, retired scholar now, said, "Oh, we're back to Mühlenhof, are we?" Now, I mean, Mühlenhof died in like 1870, and people are still saying mean, dismissive things about him in tone. He's sort of, Tom Shippey calls him the Grendel of Anglo-Saxon studies. Everyone was scared of him, and then when he died, everyone hated him. And so there's this idea that we've rejected all of that. Well, perhaps that's true, but I don't know. Let's pause there, and let's leave Tolkien and Beowulf for a few minutes, and let's do some math. I hope that was really appealing. I really like math, and it's also, the math we're doing is not a lot harder than adding and dividing, and there's a payoff. So now I switch over in this ungainly segue into the Lexomic material. And I hope you're all seeing this nice diagram I have up there. The Lexomics, what we call Lexomic methods, by the way, the word Lexomic was coined by Betsy Dexter Dyer in 2001, I believe, and it is meant to be, it plays off of genomics. So genomics tries to figure out how genes are fit together in biology and how they produce information, and Lexomics looks at lexical items, at words and word distribution. And one of the things about Lexomics is that we tend to not look at syntax. We tend to be at a lower level of, so instead of looking at how the words are arranged, we are more looking at the overall distribution of words. So our focus is on words, though as these methods have evolved, they've turned out to look at letters as well, so going down even smaller. There's two parts to Lexomics that right now, actually there's more, but the two I'm going to talk about are cluster analysis and rolling window analysis. And we'll start with the cluster analysis. So what I just put up there, that's a dendrogram or a tree diagram. This is a dendrogram. There are many like it, but this dendrogram is, well, no. This is a dendrogram is used to represent relative similarity and difference, and it uses the output of statistical analysis of the distribution of vocabulary words, what's technically called hierarchical agglomerative cluster analysis. So let me show you how this works, because it's a fairly complex looking diagram, but it's actually pretty straightforward. I ask you to imagine a set of texts that only have 2 words in their vocabulary. We're making this as simple as possible. And we just want to see which texts are more similar and to each other, and therefore which are different. By the way, it took me, I don't know, 2 years of working on this before I had this blinding realization that, hey, things that, if we're measuring similarity, we're also measuring differences, because the things that aren't similar are different. Sorry, it's maybe like Bartleman Butterbur. I can see through a brick wall in time, but it takes time. So imagine we've got these 2 texts, and one is just the word blue repeated 10 times, and the others have various ratios of red to blue. And we want to figure out which ones are similar to each other. So the first thing you'll notice is that the texts aren't the same length, because texts are rarely the same length in the real world. So all we do is we calculate what's called a relative frequency. So we divide the 10 possible words in text 1 by 10, and in text 2 it's by 6, and so forth. So we've got these texts, and we found these numbers, and that's also useful because then we have percentages and numbers smaller than 1 rather than 10s and 5s and 7s and so forth. Then we plot it, and as you can see here, we've got on one axis blue and on one axis red. So one axis is 100% blue, the other axis is 100% red, and the texts are going to be distributed somewhere else in that field percentage-wise. So they're really going to be distributed, on the lower half of the plane there, and we've plotted them based on those numbers I gave you. Now we look and we see which texts are closest together. And obviously we can do this visually, but the computer can also just calculate distances between each possible pair and find the smallest one. And so those 2 are the closest. We then take the size of that box, okay, or the size of that doesn't really matter, the length, the diagonal between the 2 texts, and we plot it. So we take text 3 and text 4, we link them together, and the vertical distance there is proportional to how far apart those texts are. We go back. We get the next text. So text 2 is the next closest one. By the way, we're taking the average then of text 3 and text 4, the midpoint, and then checking that with all the other texts. We get text 2, we take the box size, we go back, and there we have text 2. So you'll see that the vertical distance from the branch point on the right-hand side there is larger than it is from going just up to T3 and T4. Then we go and get the last text. There's T1. And we put it there. And one of the things you'll see, and I'll see if I can get my little drawing thing, is that we can find then both similarity and difference, because we can say, aha, these 2 are closest together, and this one is most distinct. We've measured both things. I like to think of it sometimes as a mobile, and if you were to cut the string at the highest level branch point, how would things fall apart? So that says 2, 3, and 4 sort of all go together. The 3 and 4 are the closest, and 1 is different. So that sounds nice. It's something that statisticians and others have figured out. How does this apply in literary text? Well, what we did is we started counting the words. We used the computer to count the words in the text. So what you can do is go from this kind of just 2-word vocabulary, you start adding words. And every time you add words, you add another dimension. But that's not a problem because distance is scalar. So it's distance a on the a-axis, and then the x, and then the y, and then the z, and then the p, and the q, and the l, and it doesn't matter. And the computer can keep track of all these things easily, and it comes up with total distance. So we can't visualize a 1,000-dimensional system, but it doesn't need to. It just calculates distance. The technical term is distance is scalar. Absolute distance rather than a vector in any direction. Vectors we're dealing with in some new stuff. So we've got that, and we started applying it to regular text. We were just messing around with Anglo-Saxon text, and we wanted to apply it to this poem Daniel. And the reason we were interested in Daniel is that there is a text known as Azarias, which is this. So Daniel is a translation of the biblical book of Daniel in the Latin Bible. It was translated into Old English, and from that lost Old English source, we got this long poem, Daniel, and a short poem, Azarias, which is just the prayer of Azarias. It's one of the three youths in the fire, thrown into the fiery furnace, who doesn't get burned up because the angel comes in and protects them, and Azarias says how happy and grateful he is, and so forth. And the thing is that Azarias and Daniel are slightly different, even in the passages that match. Azarias is more elaborate. If the opening line of Daniel is Him fa Azarias inia thonkum, the opening line of Azarias is Him Azarias inia thonke, and there's a lot of other little minor variations. And the computer is going to think of inia thonke and inia thonkum as two different words. So I merely threw this at the computer to see if we could get close. So what we did is we cut up Daniel into 450 word segments, because the DAS segment is about 450 words, and we used Azarias by itself. We produced a dendrogram, and we got a dendrogram that looked like this. And indeed, as you can see, we were pretty excited because we matched up Azarias with the correct part of Daniel. And that was just a good control. It meant that the method, in fact the method worked way better than we thought, could be used to find similarities. Not just ones like this that we knew, but maybe similarities that we hadn't previously known about, that we couldn't detect because our minds didn't pick up the patterns. And we had what was a happy accident. I wanted to see if we could still match up Azarias if we made the segments of Daniel larger. So instead of 450 word segments, I was trying for 900 word segments. Okay, so segments 1 and 2 went together, segments 2 and 3, and segments 1 and 2, segments 2 and 3, and 3 and 4, and so forth. And 3 and 4 then really became the new named segment 3. But I forgot to put Azarias into the system. And I got this dendrogram, and I was like, stupid, where's Azarias? And then wait a second. Because I realized that Daniel 3 could not be influenced by Azarias. That couldn't be the cause of it coming off the main body of the poem, because Azarias isn't in the system. And I started to think, wait a second, there's something else going on here. This technique may work in ways that we didn't anticipate. I went back and looked at the scholarship on Daniel, and it turned out that two parts of the DAS part of Daniel, the Daniel Azarias section of the poem, have an intermediate source. Paul Remley, a professor out at the University of Washington, had figured this out, that there are two Latin hymns, canticles, sung in Mass, that are based on parts of Daniel. The Oratio Azarii, the prayer of Azarias, and the Canticum Trium Puerorum, which is the Song of the Three Youths. And both of these were, the reason that you can tell that they influenced Daniel is the events in the poem follow the order, the plot order of the canticles, rather than the plot order of the Bible. And so we realized that this technique of looking at the cluster analysis and looking at the dendrogram may show us when a text has an external source. So it shows the influence of some other text behind this. And we found this in Daniel. We found it in Christ 3, where there's a sermon of Caesarius of Arles, and that part of the poem is perturbed. We found it in Guthlac and made a very strong case for the Guthlac section with the hell mouth, when demons grab St. Guthlac, take him to the mouth of hell, and threaten to throw him in. We got it to work for Latin. Just last week it was accepted in Old Norse. A paper was accepted in Viking medieval Scandinavia. It's been a very successful technique. And of course, working in Old English, the first thing I wanted to do was apply it to Beowulf. So because remember now we're looking at, we can find similarities and we can find external sources. And I wanted to apply it to Beowulf. And so we did. I put this up on my Facebook page years ago when we did it. This is a map of Beowulf. It's what we call a ribbon diagram, and this is sort of the result of 2 summers of work. You have everything on this graph, from the instances of the different types of Kaluzas Law verses, to the line numbers, to the word count absolute, to the word count for the segment, to what things relate to, and you can see all kinds of stuff. And I just like the picture. It's going to be the cover of my Beowulf book at some point. But when I posted this, one of my students said, "Beowulf, it's complicated." And Beowulf is complicated. It has been actually very complicated and somewhat difficult to work with for a variety of reasons that I'll show you. But we started working on Beowulf, trying to divide it, cut it up, and see what we could see. This is a clear version of that ribbon diagram. This is Beowulf divided up into segments. And I think if nothing else, it led to us a really good teaching tool, because Beowulf is surprisingly digressive and complex. And when you give students this ribbon diagram, they suddenly understand the poem a lot better. Now, the letters on the ribbon diagram, A, B1, C1, E1A, and so forth, are the segments that we have, through much trial and error, found to be what we call robust. And what that means is that these are the boundaries where if you shift the boundary a little bit left, a little bit right, nothing much happens in the dendrogram. So we consider this is a good division of the poem. Whereas if you move the boundaries pretty far away from there, so like say you divide that B1 in half, all kinds of weird things happen, where moving a boundary a couple, 20 lines changes the entire dendrogram. And the metaphor that I've used in this is a color metaphor. So if you imagine that segment A is red and segment B is blue, and same with, say, segment J and K, but if you cut those in half at the wrong places, you'd end up with a bunch of purple segments that all stuck together, because you'd be blending the red with the blue. So you have to keep testing, and it's a lot of moving parts until you find out like where the red is, because you don't know what it is. When this cluster analysis, we can go inside and look, and we can sometimes find like, wow, okay, that one's dividing in part because there's way more uses of the word and a lot of other function words. But in general, it's sort of a holistic measurement. It measures not just function words, but function words and content words, and there's turned out to be a lot of complexity in it, so that you can't know where the dividing lines should be without a lot of trial and error. Okay, so we've got this ribbon diagram. Then we started producing dendrograms of Beowulf. This is Beowulf just cut up into 14 even segments, and you see there's some patterning there. Right? You see, but you see one problem already, which is that everything written by the B scribe goes into its own section, its own clade. And that was a problem because we knew that the B scribe had really consistent differences from the A scribe that showed up in an awful lot of words. So, for example, the B scribe likes to use ev instead of thorn. He uses way more eths. I'll be getting to eth and thorn, but they're specific letters. And so therefore the counts ended up being off. And in fact, when we did something like force all the eths to be thorns just to see, this structure went away. So we didn't really have anything good for the B scribe at first. So we just deleted the B scribe temporarily. And we looked at the A scribe text. And we started moving boundaries around, as I said, and we even developed a procedure that we called blending. So hinting, I should go back. Hinting is when you move the boundary, say, 30 lines and run the dendrogram again, and then you move it another 30 lines, and then you move it another 30 lines. And you also try to make it match up with narrative and syntactic boundaries, so you don't just chop sentences in half. So we did a lot of hinting, and then we did some blending also. Blending's more controversial, but essentially this is a way to solve something like the fight with Grendel's mother, which goes between monster fighting, talking about monster fighting, more talking about monster fighting. And you'll see how this works. You take a segment you take the talking, you put all the talking together, you take the monster fighting, you put all the monster fighting together. The reason we were doing this is we were finding that in those segments G and H, depending on how large they got, if they were mostly monster fighting, they stuck with the Grendel fight. If they were mostly talking, they stuck with the talking. So we tried to isolate them so that we weren't mixing things up. we recognize that this is, there's maybe some issues there. But after all of that work, we were able to find some robust relationships in Beowulf that we represent with what we call a Scrabble diagram, and that is this right here. And what we see are sort of sections of the poem that consistently stick together, and that means have similar vocabulary distributions overall in relationship to the rest of the poem. The most robust of these functions is that C segment sticking off by itself. C goes by itself as long as you don't stick certain parts of E, there's a really powerful part of E, into C. C will go off on its own. And C is the Unferth episode, which is very, very interesting, which I'll talk about in a second. Also, the other big robust one is that A and F stick together. Well, A is the introduction to the poem, the part that Tolkien thought was being worked off another source, and F is the Finnsburg episode, which absolutely has another source because we have it. We have the Finnsburg, well, actually, it got lost somewhere in Lambeth Palace. I still think it's under the couch cushions there. But the Finnsburg fragment shows that there was a story of the Finnsburg episode told at a different pace and so forth. So, and it's just very interesting that they stick together, isn't it? Let me just go through what we have here. So we have monster fights, D and G. That's Grendel fight, Grendel's mother fight. We have arrivals, departures, and other things that you could call sort of set pieces. I put them in two different colors because B and I are sort of arrivals and departures, where E and H are more talking, speeches, public stuff in the hall. Then we have Danish history that shows up in those two pieces, and then we have the Unferth episode. Interestingly, J.R.R. Tolkien thought that the Unferth episode might have come from somewhere else also, though he doesn't talk about it as coming from a written text, but just another story. There's another theory out there that the Beowulf's name and the Beowulf character actually came from the Beowulf and Brecka swimming match, and then the poet decided to build him up into the hero who cleansed Herod. At this point, we can't really say, except that, boy, that Unferth episode sticks out. It's qualitatively different in vocabulary in a big way, and that A and F link together almost no matter how you slice them. Those A and F pieces are linking together. D and G are a little less stable. And then the middle stuff, it goes together, but it's all relatively homogeneous there. Okay, so that gave us the A scribe, that part of the poem. But obviously, we want to do the whole poem. And how did we do that? Normalization. This was, the student who I did this with is the smartest student I have ever taught. A young woman who's now making art with painter's tape and getting famous for doing it in Rhode Island. She's just brilliant, but it wasn't brilliance, but it was tenacity that allowed us to do this. We went through Beowulf word by word for 17,234 words. It took us 56 hours. Over the course of a week and a half or so. And we normalized the spelling to itself. So there have been other normalized to an external standard. Francis Peabody Magoon, for example, produced a normalized Beowulf, but he's wacky and did things like change Beowulf's name to Barley and so forth. So we went through finding every lemma, that's every source word in Beowulf, and making sure that it was spelled the same throughout the entire poem. It was not fun. But it allowed us to get to the B scribe and to look at the B scribe material. Now, by the way, this is doing the B scribe by itself also. That was our big test, was if we did the B scribe by itself, and then we threw in the normalized, and the normalized B scribe came out the same, and the normalized A scribe came out the same, then hopefully we could put them together. But I should tell you, like, first, this is how the B scribe comes out, whether you normalize it or not. Very interesting, nice envelope pattern, right? The intro is a funeral and buried treasure. Then there's Swedish and Geatish wars, big dragon fight, some more Swedish and Geatish wars, and then funeral and buried treasure. Nice. By the way, it took an entire summer to figure out that was the pattern. We kept there arguing and saying, I don't understand why there's too many dragon fights. And then I think it was that student, Leah, who said, hey, aren't there funerals? in both the beginning and the end, and indeed there are. The Lay of the Last Survivor and Beowulf's Funeral. Well, I should have put those up. Funerals, Buried Treasure, Dragon Fighting, Swedish History. Okay, so far so good. Now we want to put the whole poem together. And that gives you, see, we've simplified everything. Beowulf is so much easier to follow now, except in some ways that it is, right? What you have is a core, the green material, a core of highly traditional material that happens inside halls, that's people, or arriving and departing from halls, people giving speeches and stuff. And you say, wait a second, Drout, there's a dragon fight in there. It's true, but the dragon fight is very cunningly interwoven with lots of speeches. Beowulf goes, fights the dragon, then it cuts away to Wiglaf berating the cowardly retainers. Beowulf and Wiglaf fight the dragon some more, cuts away, and so forth. So I don't know about that, the bee scribe and the dragon stuff. That's for this summer. We're going to do some more work with that. But it does, and it's interesting that the Grendel fight, the Grendel stuff sticks reasonably well with the funerals and buried treasure, not the other dragon fight, though there's some other possibilities there. But certainly the historical material seems to stick together, and Unferth seems way off. Also, J, the recapitulation, sort of sticks in there. It moves around depending on where you cut it. It's a mishmash of stuff. So I don't propose that this is yet perfect, but in some ways it's a very good explanation, and interestingly, it kind of matches with what Tolkien's saying in the sense that there might be written historical material, there's something put in from Unferth Breca, and then there's the poets dealing with his tradition, but also his own stuff, his innovations, the Grendel fight, the Grendel's mother fight, the Last Survivor is possibly old, but the dragon attack there, the Beowulf's Funeral and Buried Treasure, sort of makes sense, and it's sort of consistent, and it hopefully gets us to challenge our ideas of what we think about the poem. Okay, that's cluster analysis, and that took the longest part. Now I'm going to give you really quick a new thing that we developed in the past 2 years called what we call rolling window analysis. And this started from a discussion of orthography. Because in Anglo-Saxon, we have two letters called thorn and ev that both are used for the th sound, for both the voiced and unvoiced, so f and v. So we start out, there's ev. It was imported from Irish orthography. You can see, for example, that that's an Irish-style D there, and if you put a cross over it, it becomes a thorn. Sorry, an ev, in the, like for here in the Vespasian Psalter gloss. There's also thorn. That started out life as a Germanic rune. There it is, carved into the ruffle cross, and there it is in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Now, the reason we even thought to do this is we were having some problems with thorn and ev, in that 99% of the time, with the exception of Beowulf, when you did we were worried, I should back up and say we were worried that if you count this with an ev differently from this with a thorn, you're going to end up with weird counts. But 90% of the time, it didn't matter. In other words, you can force all your thorns to be ev so that there's no difference, and you got the same dendrogram. But a few dendrograms jumped around and changed, and we didn't know why. And my student, Elie Chauvet, and I kept working on this and butting our heads and making this segment smaller and smaller and trying to figure out why they kept changing. Why are there so many evs? There's so many thorns in this one area or this other area. And we eventually came up with a way to measure it, which is we call theta. And theta is simply the ratio of the number of thorns divided by the number of thorns plus the number of evs. So it's basically saying, here are all the opportunities for a th sound. Which one did the scribe use more often? And there are characteristic ratios for every manuscript and for every scribe. But it also seems possibly that what a scribe was copying affected his ratio of thorns to evs. And if you can imagine that you're a scribe who wants to, say, have all thorns at the beginning of words and all evs at the end of words, that seems to be like the 10th century and later idea of what a good manuscript looks like. But you're copying a text that has them all mixed over. At the very beginning, you're going to really focus. But as you go on copying, you start to just mechanically copy. You get into the flow, you copy right in front of you, and your ev count goes up. That's the theory right now. It seems to be based, have some like backup for it, as I'm going to show you. So what we started to do was calculate a continuous rolling average. And I credit this to my teaching a class regularly, a co-taught class with a mathematician, was being able to try to think mathematically about it. And I started thinking first fundamental theory of calculus, right? If you have a curve, you try to get the area under it by measuring little rectangles, and you make them smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller to get that. So I thought we'll do that with Thorn and Ebb, but you ended up with a lot of little tiny segments with no data in it at all. And so then I thought, okay, another way to make a continuous curve is to have a continuous rolling average. So what you do, and this, it's actually, I'm giving you a continuous rolling ratio, but you can do average or ratio. You tabulate all the thorns and ebbs in lines 1 to 100, say, and you calculate theta, that ratio. Then you record that as a data pair of 1 for the first line and that value of theta. Then you tabulate all the thorns and ebbs from lines 2 to 101. So essentially what you've done is you've taken your window and you've moved it one thing to the right. Now 99% of that is the same as the last one, but as the values change, that value of theta will change. So you record that as 2, theta 2. And you keep going. You lather, rinse, repeat until you've got the entire text. And you get something that can be described. I just wanted to put this up here because I am publishing this in Anglia, the oldest and most conservative and most wonderfully German of all journals of English studies, and they accepted my paper with this formula in it, so I'm just so happy. I mean, it's, you know, those of you who are real science and math people like, duh, Drout, it's just sigma notation. But I'm pleased, and you know, for an English professor, this is a fun thing to do. So that just shows you what the value is of theta at any point in the text, and that's how you graph it then. And you get something that looks like that. That's part of Beowulf. I'll get back to what it means in a second. By the way, for those of you who might have an interest in messing around with this and doing it, you can do it off the lexos.wheatoncollege.edu site. That all you have to do, upload text, and all the software is free. You can also get the software from GitHub and modify it, do whatever you want with it. We are trying to make it available to as many people as possible. It's also because the NEH supported it, so we're happy to make it open source. This information, and this is one of the things we're going to be doing this summer, we hope, is basically equivalent to time series data. So we're hoping to use a whole host of advanced statistical techniques that have been developed to work with time series. That is what I'm trying to learn right now. And I actually did well in statistics. I got an A in Stats 1 and a B+ in Stats 2, but that was 20-something years ago. And so I am having to relearn a lot of it so that I'm ready to work with this stuff. And I have some students who are on the ball on it. Okay, so why do we believe that this might be important? And the answer was a few things. I didn't put the slide up here, but we did a poem called Genesis, Anglo-Saxon poem, Genesis A and B. And Genesis B, which is from a German and Old Saxon source and is almost certainly much later than Genesis A, stands out like with flashing lights in red. It has a totally different Thornev profile, even though they're both copied by the same scribe. And there's also a little part that I just discovered like 3 weeks ago. It hadn't penetrated my stupid brain, that there was this weird anomaly in the later part of Genesis A. It turns out that's the War of the Kings, which has like 2 lines in the Bible, but about 35 lines in Genesis because it turns into a whole Anglo-Saxon battle poem. Everyone knew that already. What they didn't realize is that probably has a written source, and that's going to be really important in just a second. So let's look at Daniel. And you can see here that Daniel kind of bobbles around the median, except it's got one big dip. It's got a few smaller dips and one really big dip. And interestingly enough, that dip is right at the canticum trium puerorum. In other words, one of those 2 canticles, but not the other one. This would be interesting, and we might have been able to get a paper out of it, but it got really interesting at International Society of Anglo-Saxonists conference in 2013 because an archaeologist, a great scholar named John Hines, presented a paper in which he talked about this thingy. This is called the Huntington Flip. It's a little thing. It's about that. As you can see, it's about 5 centimeters long, and we think it might have been used as a candle snuffer. To pinch a lit candle, but we're not sure. But in any event, as you can kind of barely see there, but you can see better here, it has a runic inscription on it. And what John Hines, this was, by the way, not found until 2009. It was found by a metal detector guy. And what John Hines showed is that this inscription is a variation of a line from Daniel and Azarias. And as he's presenting this, I'm thinking about my little graph of Daniel and wondering, and he says, yeah, it's line 362. And I said out loud in front of everyone in Anglo, holy crap, except maybe not that word, because it was at precisely the inflection point when the Thorn-Eth ratio changed. And putting all the evidence together, and I know that we're kind of short for time to tie us back to Beowulf, so I'm just going to say, putting all the evidence together, it becomes pretty clear that there is a lost Old English Three Youths poem. In other words, as Tolkien said about the beginning of Beowulf, something already in verse, or at least already in Old English. And I think in verse, because the lines are the same, essentially, as those in Daniel and Azarias. They're slightly different. There are little spelling differences. Obviously, they're in runes, but it's obviously the same sets of lines. And so this reconstructs the history of Daniel. We have the Book of Daniel in Latin. We don't know whether it's the Vulgate or the Vetus Latina. It doesn't really matter. We have those two canticles. From one of the canticles, somebody made a Three Youths poem, which circulated. Someone took the first line of that Three Youths poem and carved it onto the Huntington Clip. It was then incorporated into Daniel. I even speculate that it might be the reason that Daniel's made. Someone has this nice short text and says, hey, you know what would be great is if we had the whole poem of Daniel. Because remember, the Oratio Azarii, which Lexomics, which cluster analysis-wise sticks out differently, as well as the Canticum Triumphum, they both stick out regardless of which one you delete. So those are different, but only one of them shows the Thorn-Eth variation. So only one of them had a written source. So that's pretty cool. We now know sort of what, in the case of Genesis, we know what was on somebody's desk 1,000 years ago. In terms of Daniel, we've recovered evidence for a text was completely lost for 1,000 years and connect it with this newly discovered object. I mean, this is very, very exciting stuff just within Anglo-Saxon studies. But of course, there's always Beowulf. So, of course, like one of the first things we did was Thorn-Eth analysis on Beowulf. And right away you can see that there's the A scribe and the B scribe. They both have different tendencies. And we can't tell, I mean, I think we can be pretty sure that this is not, maybe Kevin Kierden's right, and they were both working off of different texts to start off with. But the kind of the straight hypothesis would be that they each just have sort of tendencies of writing. The B scribe is older, he's more conservative, and he used more eds, interestingly enough, which is possibly the older form of the two letters. So we sort of have to study each scribe independently here. Not really a problem. Let's look at the A scribe. You can see this is the A scribe material, and right away, I just gave away the game. No, there are two very interesting anomalies right away if we're just looking for big dips, and it turns out that there may be more than dips that we should be looking for. But if we're just looking for big dips in the text, there are two big ones, and they both just happen to perfectly match up with parts of the poem that other scholars have thought had sources for one reason or the other. The first is the description of the mere where Grendel and his mother live. Because for a long time people have thought that that seems really similar to a thing in one of the Blickley homilies. I actually don't agree with that. I don't think it's that similar at all. But I mean, it seems like a description of hell. Other people connected it to Virgil. But Charlie Wright, who's at Champaign-Urbana, Illinois Champaign-Urbana, a number of years ago proposed that that portion of the poem would have been influenced by a lost Old English version of the Visio Pauli. Visio Pauli is a Anglo-Saxon, medieval apocryphal text that talks about hell and the afterlife and so forth. It was part of the Bible for a long time until people realized that it wasn't written back at the time of the other books in the Bible. And Charlie Wright said, well, this couldn't have come from the Latin directly, but I think that there must have been an Old English version. And boy, this evidence is pretty consistent with it if we believe the Daniel thing and the Genesis thing and some other ones that I haven't had a chance to put in here. The next bit is Hrothgar's sermon in Beowulf, which many people have thought comes from another source. Tolkien himself thought it came possibly from Cynewulf, which is either brilliant or crazy. I haven't decided which I believe. It changes based on the day of the week. But sorry, I lost track in my notes here for a second. Hrothgar's sermon seems very different from the poem, and look at indeed it has that what we call the characteristic W shape. What we're noticing other places where you have very, very steep decline, something wiggles along at the bottom and then it goes right back up again, that seems to be connected to an insertion of some point. So right away you have some evidence, and again consistent with what, well, Tolkien didn't talk so much about the Visiopoli, but he talked about Hrothgar's sermon. Maybe. We're working on this right now. Then there's this introduction in Danish history that Tolkien thought had another source, and you'll notice here that it doesn't really, completely look like it has a. It's not like a big dip like the Visiopoli thing, but interestingly enough, if you match it up with Finnsburg, right, which is the episode that in the cluster analysis it sticks to, the amplitude of the changes seems to be about the same, and we're thinking that, again, we were still working on this, that maybe the amplitude in some ways is more important for telling you when you're switching between sources or when the poet's, say, composing on his own. And this picture would actually be very consistent with one of Tolkien's ideas, because you also see there's an Unferth episode, and look at the amplitude in the Unferth episode. It's very, very tight, almost as if, again, it had a different ratio of Thorn and Ev when the poet used it. And just from this part alone, you could make the case that the intro, the poet's reworking another source. In Unferth, he just copied the story right in there. Finnsburg, he's reworking another source, and in between with the fight with Grendel's mother, that's his own thing. He's composing that on his own and following his own tendencies. I don't know if that's the case. I know there's probably a lot of copying generations, so we still have a lot of work to be done, and we're very excited to do it this summer. We've got this grant now that will support students, and we will be doing more work on Beowulf. I've got like 5 students who want to work on technical stuff about Beowulf. It just warms my heart. We also, with the same technique of rolling windows, realized that we could better represent other data that's been studied in Beowulf. So one of these features is something called Kaluzas Law. It's complicated, but essentially Kaluzas Law is a sign of archaism, if it's right. Verses that obey Kaluzas Law would not be the way they are if Beowulf was written later. In other words, if it was after 800 or so, because those distinctions had fallen out of the language. It's sort of like if you found a poem and it used tis and or, and, O apostrophe ER and tis and other you wouldn't think it was written in the late 20th century, right? You would think that it was an older poem. And the same thing with Kaluzas Law. Well, there have been arguments about Kaluzas Law. Like I saw what was almost the equivalent of a bar fight break out over Kaluzas Law and dating of Beowulf arguments. And the reason is that it's very hard to know how to interpret the data, and it's also hard to know how to represent it. And traditionally, what people have done, most recently a scholar named George Clark, was divide Beowulf up into even-sized chunks and count how many Kaluzas Laws there are and there's about the same in every chunk. And so overall, even distribution, not statistically significant, so forth. I submit they're looking at it the wrong way. What you want to do is find concentrations of Kaluzas Law, because if Kaluzas Law verses are just old and traditional, they might show up just because they've been memorized, the same way that "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" isn't 18th century, right? It's 19th century, but there's also other versions of "'Twas" even in 20th century poems, just because it's been memorized and copied in some way. So it's not having Kaluzas Law doesn't necessarily tell you, but having clusters of Kaluzas Law probably tells you that the poem is older in that portion. And it's particularly important, or I think it's also ironic, because I got this idea from Roberta Frank, and Roberta Frank, I think, really dislikes some things that I've said about the dating of Beowulf and other things, and she was trying to use this Kaluzas Law to show that the poem wouldn't be old. She was saying, oh, Kaluzas Law clusters in dark, martial passages, and so it's just memorized there. Well, Kaluzas Law does cluster, but not only in dark, martial passages, because by using this rolling window, we can see where there's a high level of Kaluzas Law, and one of the places is right here around line 600, which we call Joy in the Hall. This is where Waltheo comes in and passes the cup around, and it's the highest concentration of Kaluzas Law in all of Beowulf. It's not dark at all. I would argue that it's exceptionally traditional, and I have a piece that I'm working on right now are showing that this passage, which has Waltheo's name and her people, the Helmings, and Hrothgar's name, and all kinds of other things that seem to be, the name of the Danes and so forth, that seem to be very, very specific to Waltheo. Actually, if you look at those lines carefully, they're exceptionally formulaic. You can put any queen's name in, because all you have to do is have a word for weapon, for example, that alliterates with it. So, maybe that we're getting something interesting. Notice we have a high concentration of Kaluzas Laws in that beginning part, and then none, or almost none, very, very low, in the Unferth episode. Almost as if it's later, maybe, and from a written text of some sort. And then you have Joy in the Hall and that cluster. And then down here you have some clusters in the Grendel fight, and the other big cluster is in that J section, the recapitulation. I have no idea what to do with that. And then this is the B scribe of the poem, and you'll see that there's very few Kaluzas Laws in the entire second half of the poem. In fact, the second half of the poem is weird, and maybe Kevin Kiernan is onto something about the two-part Beowulf, but I don't know that yet. And same thing, by the way, monosyllabification is also supposed to show archaism. You'll see that there's really only one big peak of monosyllabification. That's Finnsburg. No, is that Finnsburg? I would have to look at the data. I think that is Finnsburg, though. So, yeah, sorry, this is the Grendel's mother stuff here. This is the Grendel fight. That's Finnsburg. Sorry, this is the Grendel fight in here. Joy in the Hall, and that's Finnsburg. So, where I'm going with all of this, oh, I should check my own slides, yes. Intro to Danish history. Okay, so trying to put this all together and explain why I think this is valuable, and then I'll take some questions. Tolkien thought there was an early poem about the Danes and Herod in verse. Maybe it mentioned Grendel, but it didn't deal with Grendel in the kind of detail that our poet does, who's very good at monster fights. He thought that the Beowulf poet had reworked this material around 735 to 750 and produced the poem mostly as we've had it, and that there were some other additions or modifications of the poem. For instance, possibly in Hrothgar's sermon, possibly in that little homiletic bit in line 180 to 188, and maybe a few little tweaks here and there by subsequent poets. This is his view of the poem, and I'll say this. One, like I said, it's heretical now, but maybe that will not stay always heretical. And also, it is consistent, or how about this? It is not inconsistent with this new work we're doing with these computerized methods and with new close reading. It also keeps turning out that every time we zoom in on a particular passage that's difficult, that's showing up weird in the Lexomic stuff, it turns out to be lots of special pleading in the notes, and of course this could not be, and anytime you see writers, it's a tell. If they say of course, that means they're trying to hustle you past that this is actually not a well-reasoned argument, and that's, I think, what has happened there. Now, I'll wrap this to the great interest of everyone here in Tolkien's work by saying this. It's perhaps not a coincidence that Tolkien, in his own work, did the same sorts of things that he sees the Beowulf poet as doing, in that he synthesized multiple texts, various drafts, separate pre-existing poems inserted, references and bits in different styles. The Beowulf poet took his material from a library, assumedly at a monastery. Tolkien made all his up himself. But both produced their great masterpieces unified with a single aesthetic vision and an aesthetic effect that comes out of the synthesis and the compilatio of material in sort of the same way. They followed this principle of compilatio and produced a unified overarching vision, what Tolkien called performing an alchemy upon the source material. And Tolkien was certainly aware of this in his own work. In fact, and I owe Doug Anderson for this idea, if you read the runes on the dust jacket of the first edition of The Hobbit, it says, compiled by Professor J.R.R. Tolkien. So I think we should think about that Tolkien and the Beowulf poet. As Tom Shippey once said, Tolkien thought that he and the Beowulf poet, he writes as if he and the Beowulf poet share a unity of motive and technique. And I think that perhaps we will find that they did. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions.
So, Professor Drout, we have questions that are typed in there in the questions box. If you like, I can pick out some significant ones and ask you, or if you like, you can scroll through and
that would be great.
Take a look at those.
The questions box is very small for me to see.
Okay.
So yeah, if you want to pick out some of them.
Okay, great. Well, Sandra Hall said that last September, when Tolkien's Beowulf was published, Professor Olson observed that due to Tolkien's current renown as a fantasy author, his work on Beowulf, as revealed in this book, would perhaps be ignored or disregarded by other scholars. Have his fears been proved right, or is Tolkien's book starting to be included in university courses on Beowulf?
I think the answer is too soon to tell, because the book came out like in May, and if people were planning on teaching Beowulf this year, they would have probably already had their course set in some ways. So I don't know the answer to that. I used it in my J.R.R. Tolkien class this fall, but I did not use it in my Anglo-Saxon class. I used Seamus Heaney's the Heaney Wolf because I kind of want the students to engage more in terms of the poem. And the prose translation is very clear and straightforward, but it's not a poem. And I wish that Tolkien had finished his alliterative translation, but he never did. He only did the first 600 lines or so of the poem, and Christopher didn't publish that. I don't know why. I'm assuming, and this I don't know any information. I just am making a guess that there will be a publication of many of that with other poems at some point. So the answer is I don't know yet. I just wrote a gigantic, hideously long review for Tolkien Studies of the Beowulf translation and talked about the significance for Anglo-Saxon studies, but it will be interesting to see. A good thing is that Andy Orchard has become the Rawlinson Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon in Tolkien's old job, and he's never been like anti-Tolkien like some of the old Oxford people used to be. Though now that Tolkien is so popular and a moneymaker, Oxford is rediscovering how much they like him.
Okay, good. Now here's another question similar on the other side of what you're talking about. What has the scholarly response to Lexomics been so far? Ben Bassett asked.
Surprisingly positive in that we've had papers accepted and published in very top-tier and highly conservative journals, and I mean conservative in the best sense. Like they don't just, Journal of English and Germanic Philology never jumped on board the whole like literary theory bandwagon, though they didn't reject it either. And we've managed to publish in Journal of English and Germanic Philology, Modern Philology, Journal of Medieval Latin, Viking in Medieval Scandinavia, and the one coming out, Anglia, will be coming out later this month for the Thornet stuff. So people have been surprisingly open to Lexomics. I think that it tends to be like the theory people are the ones who are most negative about it, and mostly because they're like, well, that's only going to tell you things about like authorship or sources. It's not going to tell you anything really important about the poem, which kind of betrays what people think of as important, right? That important is interpretation rather than important is text or important is sources and structure. But I think medievalists are interested. And interestingly, we have some results of Lexomics that it works for classical Chinese, in that we did it on Dream of the Red Chamber, and that's a famous classical Chinese novel, one of the seven great classic Chinese novels, that the first 80 chapters were written by one author who then died, and then the last 40 chapters were written by someone else. And we were able to separate that out instantly with Lexomics as a nice control, even though Chinese doesn't have articles, for example, so you can't be doing it based on frequency of the and versus this and that. And so I have a couple now native speaker students who are native speakers of Chinese who are going to be working on this this summer. And it seems to work with Biblical Hebrew also, in that we did a test thing on Deuteronomy, and we're able, we picked a book where most scholars agree about how Deuteronomy was put together, and the Lexomic cluster analysis seems to match. And we have a piece coming out on Middle English where we showed that the Pearl poet of Gawain and the Green Knight fame, one that we showed that the poem St. Erkenwald was also written by that poet, which most people suspect, and also that unexpectedly that the Pearl poet most likely had a Middle English apocalypse, maybe even in verse, as a source for part of his description of the heavenly Jerusalem. And we did Shakespeare with the Two Noble Kinsmen, where we were able to separate out the parts by Shakespeare and Fletcher, and then demonstrate that you can apply this to Henry VIII and see what parts Shakespeare and Fletcher wrote there. And it matches up with a lot of previous scholarship, but actually comes out a little bit more elegant, and we've used a whole combination of the techniques for that, and we're writing that up too. So people have been, to my surprise, pretty open about it. Mostly, I think, because we're not trying to make interpretive claims. We're trying to just say, here's what's behind the text, here's how this text was put together.
Well, that's great, and you've actually just covered a whole bunch of the other questions that people have asked here, because they really wanted to know, well, what else have you tried putting this method on? So some of the specific questions are, have you analyzed any of Tolkien's work with this? Have you tried applying it to a single writer's career, such as Yeats was a suggestion?
That we haven't done. I'll tell you about the Tolkien stuff.
Okay.
It's in the piece that I put it. Me and a bunch of student co-authors wrote for the last volume of Tolkien Studies, Tolkien Studies 11, Tolkien's creation of the impression of depth, and we looked at the published Silmarillion, and we were able to distinguish in a dendrogram the parts of the Turin chapter that Tolkien that Christopher had to cobble together versus the ones that Tolkien wrote. In other words, what was taken from the Narn and what was much older. What was written in the 50s versus what was written in the 20s and 30s for the Turin material. And so even within a single writer, we were able to catch those stylistic variations. Also, we didn't publish it because it wasn't really relevant to the argument, but if you dendrogram out the published Silmarillion by chapter, the War of Wrath chapter comes out as being radically different than everything else, and that completely makes sense because Christopher had to write so much of that, as in Art of Reconstructed, Doug Kane shows that chapter he just didn't have Christopher didn't have the material for it and had to write it. We also did it with the Lord of the Rings, and until this week I would have told you that the results didn't make any sense, but now I'm wondering. The chapter of the Lord of the Rings that sticks out as being different from every other chapter is Strider. And at first we thought this might be because it includes a letter. We found in other texts, Latin texts and others, that the inclusion of a letter really, really perturbs the text, maybe because the letter's in a different style or just letter writing is a different style. But Strider, we took the letter out, and Strider still went off there. But it was only just this week I've been doing a tutorial with a student out in California on the history of the Lord of the Rings through the History of Middle-earth books, and we're reading The Return of the Shadow. And it becomes clear that Prancing Pony Strider material, Tolkien wrote two completely separate drafts. Like, took the story in different directions with what is his name? Timothy Titus, I think, is the name of Barham and Butterbur, and one they're men and one they're hobbits, and he selected one of them and put it in there. And so it may just be again where he has a different source because he was rewriting his own different styled text to come in there. So yes, but there's still way more work to be done. We've tried it with Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes' play Mulebone, and are sort of, we think, able to separate out some of those. But there's a lot of work to be done. All the software that does this is web, like you can use it over the web. You don't have to download it or anything. And it's just at lexos.wheatoncollege.edu. And lexomics.wheatoncollege.edu has all the instructional videos and explanations, though those are going to be all updated this summer. And you can also download it. I think I mentioned this. You can download it from, if you look to Lexomics at GitHub, if you're a person who wants to modify it and change it. So anyone here is welcome to go play with it and see what you find. And all we ask is just let us know. You know, when you publish, when you write up on it, when you make discoveries, just let us know. We'll put it on the website. NEH is happy about that too. So.
Okay, so there are a couple other texts that people are asking about specifically. Two that I see them mentioning are Homer. Have you tried to apply it to Homer? And how about the Pentateuch? Have you been able to apply it to look at the authorship question of the Pentateuch?
I have another student actually, the sister of the one I'm doing the tutorial with on the Return of the Shadow and the Treason of Isengard. She's messing around with the Hebrew Bible. She's done Deuteronomy as a control, and now we're trying to look at Pentateuch. I also want to do it with the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. I really like to see if the traditional view that Luke also wrote Acts is substantiated. But the problem is I don't read Greek. So we've needed, I right now have a student who's a native speaker of modern Greek, and so she may be someone who can help us there. But it's one of the limits is that we don't want to be doing just 100% Lexomics. That's where I think that the literary establishment would go kind of nuts if you're like, hey, look, this is just what the graphs show. But we want to be able to read in the text and try to show spots where this might be relevant in narrative terms, in stylistic terms. So just for an example, we showed in Guthlac that Hellmouth scene right at the beginning of where we think the divide is. The poet says, as books tell us. And for, 100 years of scholarship, people said, well, that reference to books must be a reference to the Bible. Now, I was not the best student in Sunday school, but I'm pretty sure that Guthlac is not in the Bible. And people just accepted this. They're like, oh, yeah, Guthlac is from the Bible. So, no, I would say that the answer is the poet's being completely straightforward, right? The poet is saying, I had a source for this section I'm going to tell you. I think an Anglo-Saxon prose source. My co-author Sarah Downey says a Latin prose source, and we fight back and forth about it. It had a source of some sort, and so we have not yet done Homer, Pentateuch, and the Gospels. And I have a student who really, really wants us to mess around with Isaiah and Ezekiel because he thinks that there's a lot of argument to be made about those having composite authorship. So. Mm-hmm. What happens is that right now I think I've got 15 students signed up to spend their summer in the computer lab working on these things, and what we hope is that people just start picking up the techniques and trying them and on their own.
Well, on that note, someone asked whether they'd be welcome to contact you if they were interested in getting more explanation on how to use the software, or who else should they talk to? Should they just go through your website, or do you want to suggest some other contact person?
They can go through the website, but my email is mdrout@wheatoncollege.edu, and during the semester I may be a little bit slow to answer just because of lots of student emails and stuff like that. But I would be happy to hear from people. I mean, that's our goal in the end. You can invent the methods and sit on them. And try to have a paper farm and nobody else can do it, but that's not very convincing. And that's not what I think scholarship should be about. I mean, I think scholarship is about finding out the answers. And also, can I tell you, it is addicting. It is so compared. This is what the scientists have been hiding from us humanities people all along, is that it is so addicting to get like new information pop up on your screen that you haven't thought to look at. The first time you run a text, the first time you cut something up, the first time something works, it is so, to me, so much more gratifying than this is my interpretation of the such and such scene. I mean, I've now got to have a few moments where I knew something that nobody else in the world knew for 1,000 years, and that is such a rush. And I want more people and more, students and scholars and everyone else to be able to experience that. And I think it's wide open right now. I mean, it turns out that so much more stuff is collaborative and multi-authored than we ever think about. Because we've this inherited Victorian notion, right, of a lonely writer by himself locked up in an attic and pouring out his soul. But for the 1,000 years beforehand, writing was about finding all the best parts and putting them together. And who cared if you wrote it or somebody else wrote it if it worked? And I think there's just so much more to be found out. People are now coming to me with things like, hey, did you know about these two Victorian poets that were married to each other and they finished each other's work? And then, no, but let's try it. Shakespeare, Renaissance drama, Homer, other oral traditional stuff. The Song of Roland turns out to have a section that should be studied if I can find someone who reads Old French. There's so much that can be done here, and the big thing is we stumbled into this technique. People have been doing dendrograms on literary stuff. They just hadn't been slicing it up into segments. They've been doing the whole text, whole novel versus whole novel versus whole novel. And the only reason we cut it up into text, it wasn't segments, it wasn't any like brilliant genius thing, it was just that I wanted to look at Daniel and Azarias. And the same thing with the rolling window thing, that was simply how do we solve this problem? So it is wide open. If you're graduate students, undergrads, independent scholars who are interested in stuff, there's so much to do right now.
We were talking about this last week in the Beowulf class when we were discussing intertextuality and variety of attitudes towards authorship throughout history. And we looked at C.S. Lewis's essay, The Genesis of a Medieval Text. We looked at how he talks about collaborative work and anonymous work. And I've got a couple questions here from attendees coming in about different attitudes towards authorship. Would you say that attitude you just described, the solitary romantic writer alone in his garret, getting this inspiration and writing this solitary work, would you say that's been a minority attitude in the history of approaches to writing?
I think that attitude is just it's way post-medieval, and it just they talk about things like scribal interference. But if the scribe does a really good job, if the scribe really improves something, right? You don't think of it as interference. You just think, hey, that's a great text, that's a great line. You don't see it there. And in the medieval period in particular, but coming out of late antiquity, there was this whole idea of compilatio. So I think that's right, that the attitude towards individual authorship is very different. And I mean, since you're talking about Lewis, there's Diana Gleer's work on the company they keep, right? That excellent book which talked about the Inklings as sort of like a writing seminar. And again, sure, Tolkien, absolutely, Tolkien, and Lewis, they have credit for their own work. And in fact, when you look at Lewis's corrections, both to the Beowulf translation and to the Lay of Luthien, when Lewis made those suggestions, Tolkien incorporated almost none of them. But that doesn't mean that Lewis didn't profoundly influence everything Tolkien was writing as an audience, as feedback. You don't know how many lines, we never will know how many lines came about because of something Lewis said that Tolkien half remembered when he went back and was revising the piece, and that was a great one-liner, and that was somebody else's line. So, I mean, I think that what I hope from like a literary, if you want to say a literary theory or a high-end philosophical point of view, is if we can measure this stuff, if we can detect this kind of difference, it's going to have to make us rethink our ideas about authorship and about how things are. You collaborate with I mean, I don't want to push it too far, right? But you collaborate with the existing language and the existing histories, and then you introduce things that you invented, and some of them work, and some of them don't work and you get rid of them after a while. I mean, if you think about the influence of Max Perkins on Hemingway and Faulkner and those writers, how many things did Hemingway write and how many things did Max Perkins pick up his pen and cross out or add or fix? The writing process is far more collaborative, and on a practical level, and this does not mean, and as I've said to my students, this does not mean cheating, this does not mean plagiarism or anything else like that, but it means that if we reconfigure the writing process as being a highly collaborative enterprise, we may get better at it too. And I think that's that's the message of Glier's book and the Inklings. They were such great writers. Yes, they were geniuses, absolutely. But they were also great writers because instead of jealously guarding their ideas, they shared them, they spread them around, they discussed and communicated, and that led to something better. So that's sort of my really grandiose hopes, is that we this material, once you can measure something, it's hard to deny that it exists.
Okay, and as a final question, several people have been asking, when will we see your book on Tolkien, and when should we be looking for some publications on Tolkien and Lexomics?
The Tolkien book needs 2 more chapters to be rewritten, and I've been neglecting it because I've been working so much on the Lexomic stuff, and that's sort of the plan through the summer. My goal is that the Tolkien book is at the printer about a year from now, and I know people have been waiting for it, but I want it to be good. And also, I've had some good luck with working with people from Lord of the Rings Online and talking to them, and I have a chapter on the Lord of the Rings Online and what you have to do to create Middle Earth. So I want to get that to work. Sitting here on my desk is this beast of a Beowulf paper. That's part 1. So I don't, and that's just the cluster analysis. The other part is the rolling window analysis, which is already 30 pages there. That's supposed to be done by the end of the summer. Maybe that just morphs into a book about Beowulf as opposed to articles, and it would just be something like, Lexomic may, again, it'll sound better in the original German, right? But Lexomic, Lexomic analysis of the introduction to Lexomic analysis with a particular attention to Beowulf. Let's make it as German and Victorian as possible. But those are sort of the goals. This summer, I am leading these tours. By the way, there is still room on I believe both tours, the Anglo-Saxon and the Anglo-Saxon Britain one and the Iceland sagas one. So I'm doing 2 different weeks of that over the summer and running the Lexomics lab. And so I'll be around doing that kind of research, and it should be fun. But it's a lot on the plate, which only saying it out loud like that made me like, oh my gosh, what have I signed up for? But it should be good. I'm going to have a lot of good students. Though you find that in the Lexomics lab, the way we do it, we make everybody work in the same room. We have a big room with a set of tables in the middle and computers all around the walls and that Beowulf whiteboard. And so that we all exchange ideas, the computer scientists and the literary people, everybody mixing it together. And a visiting scholar came and she laughed because she's like, it's almost like that you're in a preschool classroom in the sense that every 2 seconds it's like, Professor Drout, can you look at what I've got here? Professor Drout, over here, Professor Drout. So I don't ever get anything done, but all advances on many, many different fronts. And that's what's really cool about doing it, and also proves that undergraduates can do original research. That undergraduates are not. I'm saying this because I teach at a school that's all undergraduates. That undergraduates that teaching undergraduates is not a punishment. It's actually a great it's a great pleasure, and they sometimes come up with stuff that I never would have come up on my own, and that's really exciting. And the more minds, the better, I think.
Hear, hear. Here again when we have those. All right, so thanks, Mike. Goodbye for now.
Excellent. Thanks very much. And Joe, just for me, I can just click the log out button and I'm done?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.